Clear prop.
Star 73, Yankee number 2, following twin traffic, 3 mile final, clear Pleasantville. 1 Charlie Bravo, exit in runway 25, going 4 mile final.
This is Behind the Prop with United Flight Systems owner and licensed pilot Bobby Doss and his co-host, Major Airline Captain and designated pilot examiner Wally Mulhern. Now let's go Behind the Prop.
What's up, Wally?
Hey, Bobby, how are you?
I am fantastic as always. Happy New Year's, listeners out there. We took the month of December off to spend a little time refreshing and spending time with our family and friends. Hopefully everybody had a good holiday season, and we are back at it full force, releasing shows every other week, telling stories and sharing our lessons and history from behind the prop. So hopefully I'll keep enjoying and keep listening as we enter into 2024. Today, we reflected on a lot of stuff we talked about last year and the year before, and there's still some big inconsistencies that we see around this flight school and Wally sees on check rides. Last year, we did 146 positive, meaning they passed check rides at this flight school. Wally, you know how many numbers you did last year?
I didn't. I don't, but I can tell you in just a second, so keep talking.
I'm going to guess it's 200 plus. That'd be 4 a week, but I'm going to guess 200 plus. But the number of check rides that the two of us have seen, both from me from the ground and Wally from the air, is staggering, and there's a few things that we just keep coming back up. So today's show's title is going to be a Pro, and we're going to try and point out 3 or 4 things that applicants and student pilots and students of all variations, multi-engine student pilots is, of course, count here, aren't doing things that look like a pro. How many numbers was it there, Wally?
189 completed check rides.
So that in our world, that's probably 350 that were scheduled or started that didn't happen for one reason or another. We've had some bad luck around here with weather. We had, in the last, 4 days, we had 8 scheduled, and we've completed 1 because of weather.
Yeah.
So it's no fun when the weather's like it is. So be a pro. That's the topic today. And we're going to start with one that's near and dear to Wally's heart. If you've listened to every show in our history, you've probably heard some of this before, but it is all about checklisting like a pro. Wally's been a big-time pilot for 36 plus years now. And has had responsibilities for checklists and how they're made and been to school on this stuff. So you could learn a lot from him. But Wally, let's talk about some of your pet peeves and some of the things that you're seeing on check rides that really make people checklist like a rookie or an applicant.
Well, when we look at checklists, so let's put them into 2 different buckets. Let's talk about normal checklists. And then let's talk about non-normal checklists. And non-normal checklists, some people are going to call them an emergency checklist, an abnormal checklist, whatever. But anything that is not a normal checklist is a non-normal checklist. So, how do we use checklists? Do we use a checklist like a checklist, or do we use a checklist like a do list? And what does a do list mean? Let's take an example of going to the grocery store. And you make a list, a grocery list. That's, in essence, a checklist. So let's say we have 3 things on our grocery list. We want to go in, we want to buy bread, we want to buy hamburger meat, we want to buy ketchup. Okay. Is it okay to look at the list and say bread? Okay, let me walk over to the bread section, put the bread in the basket. Now look at the checklist. What's next? Hamburger meat. Okay, walk over to the meat section, get your hamburger meat, throw it in the basket, so forth. Is there anything wrong with that? No, nothing wrong with it. Is it also okay to walk into the grocery store, go over to the bread section, boom, grab your bread, go to get your hamburger meat, go get your ketchup. Before you check out, take a look at the checklist and use it and go, okay, yeah, bread, check. Hamburger meat, yes. Ketchup, yes, I've got all 3. That is really a checklist. The first example would be a do list. And again, there's nothing wrong with it, but it's kind of 2 different ways to do a checklist.
How do you do it as a pro?
Well, when you get to the pro level, you're going to do it as a checklist, and you're going to learn flows. In other words, you're going to learn a before start flow, before we start, at least on a 777, we get fuel pumps on, we turn the fasten seatbelt sign on, we turn the rotating beacon on, that sort of stuff, and we start the engines. We have a before start checklist, but before we do that checklist, we run through the flow, and then we back it up with a checklist. By and large, I see most of our students going out to the run-up area and doing their before takeoff checklist as a do list. Throttle or RPM, 2,000. Run up to 2,000. Magnetos, check. They check them. Carburetor heat, check. Controls, flight instruments, whatever. Rather than kind of going through and coming up with a flow and then backing it up with the checklist. And again, neither one is wrong. But at the higher level, you're going to be expected to do it via a flow and back it up with a checklist. And don't for 1 second anybody take this to mean that we don't use checklists. That could not be farther from the truth. But we use checklists as a true checklist. One of my pet peeves with the Piper and Cessna, most of the checklist is the control check is on the maybe on the run up or the before takeoff checklist. And my whole point is if my controls are not correct, I don't even want to start the engine. There's no sense in taxiing out to the run up area and realize that the ailerons are rigged backwards and then taxi back in. Let's figure this out before we even start the engine. So that's one thing I do before I even start the engine on a non, boosted airplane, a small airplane. Check the controls before you do all that. Okay, yeah, controls are checked. So now when I get up to the run-up area and I do my run-up and it says controls checked, I'll say, yeah, they're checked. I already did that. I did that 10 minutes ago before I pulled out of the parking spot.
But the Blue Angels do their thing right before they go. They check all their controls right before they
do it. It's really cool, isn't it?
That's, I think, for part of the show.
Yeah.
It's not for making sure they didn't start a plane that didn't have controls wired correctly.
Right.
So that I actually learned something this morning, and we actually talked about this a few times, but I do feel like as a younger student, I would have never made sense of that information, right? And I think there's probably a category or many categories of people listening to this at different stages in their career. And we're not saying that you should maybe memorize flows before you ever start your flight training, but there is a time that Wally and I discussed before we started recording today that, when you get to that commercial training, you've done your private, you've done your instrument, and you're still flying a Cessna 172, you probably need to start thinking about flows that you're verifying with a checklist if you want to be a professional pilot. It's only going to start ingraining those things into you, but not the abnormal stuff, right? Like
Exactly.
We had an acquaintance recently who was struggling to start an aircraft, and he ultimately never got started and had to change his plans for the day. And we were both speaking with him afterwards, or I know I spoke with him afterwards. And I asked him, I said, what'd you do different? How did you go about changing things? And did you look at the checklist? And he literally said it wasn't on the checklist. And I said, which checklist? Like it was out of the POH? He goes, well, no, the one we have in the plane. And I'm like, well, if we put everything on the checklist in the plane, what would that be? Well, that'd be the whole POH. Like if you had every number on everything that has to happen. And so what he should have done is pull out the POH. It's
right
in the plane. He should have looked at the POH. I can say, I bet a professional pilot, no matter what the abnormality is, would refer to a checklist when they couldn't make things happen the way they wanted to make them happen.
Absolutely.
And it's shocking how often, recently we had a plane with a little electrical problem. Every time the low voltage light came on, they followed the checklist and the low voltage light went off. That's pretty impressive. Like the guy that built that plane in 1960, or the design of that electrical system, provided all future pilots a mechanism by which they could solve that problem and make that low voltage light go away. And
yes,
it's pretty powerful tool if you use the checklist. Now, The in the hallway checklist on how to start a plane that's a little hard to start, that don't count. I bet we could still refer to the real checklist in every instance and get that plane started 99.9% of the time.
Well, I'll tattle on myself a little bit. I think most of the listeners know I own a Saratoga, turbocharged Piper Saratoga, a beautiful airplane. And when I went up to buy it many years ago, the guy that checked me out and said, okay, well, do this, scratch your nose, blink your eye twice, and it'll start. And it did. Well, it wasn't too long after it that I started having difficulty starting the airplane, especially when the engine was warm. If the engine was hot, in other words, I just went and refueled and started it, it would start right back up. If the engine was cold, it was fine. But it was when that engine had been sitting for about 45 minutes to an hour, it was just a booger to start. And you know what? I pulled out the checklist, the POH, and guess what? There's a procedure in there, and it works every time.
That's awesome.
So I felt like a real idiot for doing that. But what I would say is about these non-normal checklists is those now are do lists, okay? Because we don't really want to memorize the abnormal emergency checklist unless it's memory items. Some manufacturers do have memory items that you need to know, and that's usually the more complex airplanes that may have to do with emergency descents for a rapid decompression and getting oxygen on and that kind of stuff. But by and large, most of our checklists do not, and we're not talking about catastrophic failures. We're talking about maybe an indication that something is going wrong. We really want to just pull out the checklist and adhere to the checklist and use that now as a do list. Now, when you're reading a checklist, think of having another crew member with you. And that other crew member may not be a pilot. It may be your buddy that you're taking for an airplane ride. It may be your mother that you're taking with you. And as long as you're reading that checklist appropriately, that other person can possibly back you up and help you stay out of trouble. If you say, flux capacitor switch on, and you reach over to where the flux capacitor and that person in the airplane sees that it's in the off position, they're very possibly able to say, I thought you said it was on. And you might say, oh, yeah, geez, I missed that. So just read the words. Read every word on the checklist, but only the words on the checklist. Don't start adding and don't take away, okay? Because we add words to a checklist and we change the meaning of a sentence. For instance, the left side of the checklist usually has the thing that we're talking about, maybe fuel pump. The right side of the checklist has the action or the verb, so that basically that line of a checklist is a sentence. Fuel pump on. So it's a command. You're saying to turn the fuel pump on. Well, if you add a word to that and you put is in the middle, fuel pump is on, it's no longer a command, it is now a statement. And it may be a false statement, maybe the fuel pump is off, but you're really changing the whole meaning of that sentence, if you will. And I don't mean to get into fourth grade English and grammar, but that's kind of what we're talking about here. So when you read an abnormal checklist, read all the words, but only the words. And that's hard for us to do for some reason. I call it oral diarrhea. We just start talking and just stuff starts coming out of our mouth that shouldn't come out of our mouth.
What if it does say flaps as required?
Okay, as required is never, ever an appropriate checklist response. Okay, so if the checklist says flaps as required, saying in the airplane, saying flaps as required, you've said absolutely nothing. You've wasted breath. The reason it says as required is because the person writing the checklist, different situations dictate different positions for the flaps. So certain things are going to say as required. You may see nav lights as required because at night they should be on. Maybe during the day they're off. Okay, so we don't really want to say flaps as required. We want to say flaps 20 degrees, flaps down, flaps up, whatever. You want to recite the position of the flaps.
And again, that's so the other crew member can possibly visually verify that it is where you say it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
Instead of making one of those maybe false statements or changing the lingo in some way.
Yeah.
I do think the crew piece is interesting because I, as a commercial student, really got coached on how to act like a crew member, had a good instructor who did that and kind of shared some thoughts with me. And then later on, I've got to fly with other professional pilots who, it's almost unnatural for them to be in the cockpit and not be acting as a crew member. Maybe it's almost blasphemy for a professional pilot to be up front and not be doing something to help, because it's just going to lighten the load on the person that's PIC or acting as PIC. And I've had some unique opportunities, but when you have the chance with another pilot with you, you should work as a crew, and that crew member should be able to clearly articulate or understand what you're saying, especially when they're using the checklist and maybe a division of duties. That would definitely make you be more like a pro for sure. We have a couple more things we want to talk about, like radio and flying. And I had a experience recently where another designated pilot examiner who comes to this school quite a bit rented a plane, and I was just making sure they were getting where they needed to go and getting back. And it was unique. I was actually intrigued with just how straight the line was in FlightAware and how well the altitude was being held. And I particularly know that airplane has no autopilot. And you normally joke when you see somebody flying, if they had autopilot on or not, right? And in this case, you would have thought autopilot was on. And as they were getting close, I knew they were going to be talking, so I listened to live ATC as well, just making sure that they got back into the hangar. And I think I told Wally the next day or so that I heard about 12 words from that man. So from telling the tower he was entering their airspace or coming to land, said about 12 words. It was the most professional exchange I've ever heard. Now, a little tidbit, this guy has retired from major airlines and has probably a master pilot certificate for 50 years plus of flying and knows what he's doing. But what I thought was interesting that Wally said before we started recording was, and he wasn't working. He had no real effort going into that, right? He's so far in front of the plane, so little moving of the yoke, so little trim changing, so little throttle changing. He said it and forgot it and came all the way home at the right altitude, at the right airspeed, at the right trim. And then the descent is amazing as well. So what makes someone like that? Obviously experience, but how do we all change maybe the way we do things and both fly like a pro and then talk like a pro on the radio?
Well, I've used the phrase that I've come up with, economy of words, and it's saying more with less. Probably the less we can speak on the radio, the better.
Real quick, we had a recent interaction with another person. Both of us were talking, and when we were done, you walked away and you said, they just said an awful lot of stuff, but I don't know what they said.
I think what I said is they talked a lot, but they didn't say anything.
There you go. Yes.
Yeah. You talk a lot, but didn't say anything.
I've heard those people on the radio too.
Right. And so, we want to, when we're talking ATC, there's certain things that we need to give them, but we don't need to give them our pilot certificate number. We don't need to give them our phone number. I'm being facetious with that. I had a young man the other day, and we were going to make the initial call up to, I think, approach control, and he called him up. He said, "Houston approach, Skyhawk 123 Alpha Bravo, heading 150 and at 2,000 feet." Well, as most of you know, I'm a professional airline pilot, so I spend my share of nights in a hotel, probably 8 to 12 nights a month I'm in a hotel. and occasionally I order room service. When I order room service, I have to tell them what room I'm in. I have to tell them I'm in room 827. And they, guess what? They bring the food to room 827. It's kind of a pretty cool thing. Now, I don't tell them I'm on the 8th floor and I'm looking north. So, to tell ATC, why does ATC want to know where you are? Because they want to know about where to look on their scope for you. You tell them I'm 10 miles east of XYZ Airport. Well, he knows where XYZ Airport is, the controller does, and they can look 10 miles east and look for you. Your heading means nothing. It means absolutely nothing for the initial call-up. Now, he may say, what's your heading? Well, I'm heading 150. But your heading doesn't tell them where you are. It tells you which way you're looking. I'm looking, it's like me telling room service. I'm on the 8th floor and I'm looking out the window. Okay.
The thing I hear around here the most, and I think it happens in the air a lot too, but it does happen on the ground. We have a pretty busy airport around here, and lots of activity, lots of schools, lots of jets, lots of people talking on the ground control, and it's the conversation starts off with Cessna 12345, ground control, go ahead. Cessna 12345, we'd like to taxi. Ground control back to they just go back and forth. I think in the air, much like that gentleman, you should just say your call sign, type of aircraft, and everything you want to get out. These controllers are pros.
Yeah.
They can handle it. They do not want to have a conversation. And this DPE that was flying back, he was very succinct and very short, and he didn't want to have a conversation. He wasn't trying to regroup with that long-lost family member. He was trying to get on the ground, and it was nighttime. There was no other radio chatter. They could have had a conversation, but as a pro, you never know when something's going to happen, and you just want to be as short and sweet and as professional as you can when you're talking to the tower or any air traffic controller for that matter.
Yeah, I mean, the conversation might be Hooks Tower, Skyhawk 12345, 12345, go ahead. 12345, 15 northwest, inbound for landing with Bravo.
That's it.
You said everything. I hear a lot of people on check rides. They'll say inbound with Bravo, but they won't say for landing or touch and go or what. Now, absence of saying something, ATC is going to assume that you're coming in to land.
No question.
Okay, so 15 miles northwest, inbound with Bravo.
But that bites a lot of flight school students for sure.
Yes.
Who come in and then are cleared to land, and they were really wanting to do touch and goes, and then they take right back off and get in a lot of trouble with that tower.
Right. And, it's the same thing at a non-controlled airport. As you're making traffic call-outs at a non-controlled airport, Navasota traffic, Cessna 12345, left downwind, runway 17, touch and go. You hear a lot, left downwind, runway 17. Well, if there's another airplane in the traffic pattern, you can really help them out by letting other people know what you're doing. And the other thing in my little example, I said left downwind. Well, yeah, left-hand traffic pattern is the standard, but we were going into a non-controlled airport the other day, and we heard an airplane just calling downwind, and I got on the radio. I said, "Are you on a right downwind or a left downwind?" And you could tell that the person was a little bit irritated with me that I asked, because this airport was a standard traffic pattern, but these are recommended. And if I'm at a non-controlled airport with a student and we haven't ever done right traffic, this may be my opportunity to say, hey, we're going to do some right traffic. So you might be on a right downwind.
You never know.
So just the more information that you can give with less is just better for everybody. I mean, our ultimate goal is to not die, not hit another airplane.
And one extra word's not really extra. It's got so much information in it for those other people that may be coming into that airspace or already in that airspace. It's going to be extremely valuable.
Right.
No question about that for sure. And I think the other piece of that for what I saw on FlightAware and what I heard on Live ATC was just the crispness of what he was doing, right? And I think the flying piece was more impressive. The radio was pretty impressive, but it was something that made me think, like, how do we teach people to be better like that? Because I think we want to sound like a hot dog more often than not. Do you ever hear any Mavericks out there in a Cessna 172?
You hear it all the time.
Wind check.
Yeah.
Wind check.
Yeah. And again, economy of words. The more I can say with less, the better. And I remember talking to my father about this, and he had listened to me going around the traffic pattern, and I came back in. He told me, he says, you're talking a whole lot, and I think that may have been the first time I heard the phrase, "You're talking a lot, you're just not saying much," and then I started thinking about it, and readjusted the way I say things. And it's like this. One of my best friends happens to be my dentist. But when I go into his, and he's to this day, he's still my dentist. And when I go in for dental work with him, I go in to get my teeth cleaned every 6 months, and he comes in and looks in my mouth, and the conversation we have in his dental office is different from the conversation we have over dinner. It's actually pretty professional in the dental office. We joke around a little bit. How you been? I haven't seen you in a while. Let's get together. That kind of stuff. Maybe over the radio, maybe isn't the time to have the chit chat with air traffic control. I mean, there's some of that goes on, and you hear it more maybe at non-controlled airports with airplanes talking to each other. But I think one thing we have to understand is a lot of non-controlled airports share the same CTAF frequency. Mm-hmm. So you think you're over at airport XYZ. Well, airport ABC, GHI, and JKL have that same frequency, and all those people are listening to you guys have your conversation about going to play golf tomorrow afternoon.
You might not hear them, but they might hear you too.
Yeah.
That's a
right.
little known fact that you may not be aware of. Depends on where your squelch is set, lots of different things.
Yeah.
They might be telling you to hush, and you might still be talking about the front nine from yesterday.
Right.
So talk about not working hard. If this guy's flying this plane, how's he able to do it when we all know pitch, power, and trim? What makes the actual controlling the aircraft or being a better pilot? Obviously it's experience, but what kind of message could you pass on to listeners who might not fly in a straight line or might not be able to hold altitude? They got 300 hours.
Well, I would think, I do a lot of sports analogies, and I think if you look at any athlete doing any sports event, let's just take a major league batter, a hitter up to hit, as he is standing there and the pitcher's about to throw a baseball at him at about close to 100 miles an hour, they're probably going to look pretty relaxed. And probably if you went up to them and grabbed the bat out of their hand, it would come right out, because they are not gripping that bat extremely hard, I would think. I don't know. I've never hit a 100-mile-an-hour fastball, but I play drums, and I know as a drummer, if you came up to me while I was playing and grabbed the stick, it would just come right out of my hand. So it's held without tension. It's a relaxed feeling, and that's kind of how we ought to be flying these airplanes. If you're working hard, and this is no knock against the fellow DPE that you saw flying, but I'm telling you, if that line was so straight, I'm telling you, he was not there fighting against the trim the whole time. No. It was hands off. It was pretty much hands off. He had that trim just locked in to the perfect trim setting for that airplane. And as he maybe burned a little fuel, maybe that trim got adjusted just a little bit. Maybe he just began to see a little bit of a climb, so a little bit of nose down trim along the flight. So
3 hours in, there would have to be some recognition,
right?
And I think that's the difference. Part of the difference is a guy like that's been a professional for a long time and his scan's good. He would pick that up where maybe someone else wouldn't.
Yeah,
you travel 300 miles in the air. The winds are going to be different, and you pay attention to that, and you correct for that, and you solve for that, but you solve for that with 1/10 of a pound of pressure on the yoke instead of leaving your fingerprints in the yoke and turning back and forth 6 times to get back on that heading, right? I think it's a control. He was controlling the aircraft. The aircraft and the wind wasn't controlling him.
Exactly.
He was fully aware of the situation, and his mind was wrapped around it, and he was staying in front of the aircraft.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I learned as I got more hours under my belt. And I would say, no matter where you're at in your training, if you think about trying to be in control and making the plane do what you want it to do, you're probably going to get there a little faster, meaning get to that level, that skill level that's more like a pro, where you're doing very little work to make the plane do what you want the plane to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been known to, on a private and an instrument, we do unusual attitudes. So I'll take the controls and I will say, okay, we're going to do some unusual attitudes. I have the controls, and they'll relinquish control to me, and a lot of times the airplane is way out of trim, and I'll give it back to them. I say, no, that's not the way this airplane should be. So get it trimmed properly, and then give me the controls.
I can remember fighting that trim wheel, and I think it was not the correlation of what the energy was doing and how that plane was supposed to fly straight and level. And when you trim it and you get to where the pressure's not where you don't have to put any pressure on it, and you change that throttle, well, you broke everything. You got to start all over.
Right.
And it took me a long time to figure all that stuff out.
Yeah, it does. And
sure.
it should not be hard work to fly straight and level. Once you get things figured out, the airplane should be, and you are in control. I mean, again, another quote from my father. He said to me one day, "What are you doing when you put the seatbelt on?" And his answer was, "You're strapping the airplane to your back. You are in charge of that airplane."
No question. And we are excited to be back. 2024 is going to be a good year for all of us. We want your feedback. We got a lot of great comments over the holidays about enjoy our time off and come back strong. That's what we're doing. If you have show ideas or content you'd like us to cover, don't hesitate to shoot it to us on social media or via email, Bobby at behindtheprop.com and Wally at behindtheprop.com. We'd love to hear from all of you. Have a great year. Fly safely and stay behind the prop.
Thanks for checking out the Behind the Prop podcast. Be sure to click subscribe and check us out online at behindtheprop.com. Behind the Prop is recorded in Houston, Texas. Creator and host is Bobby Doss. Co-host is Wally Mulhern. The show is for entertainment purposes only and is not meant to replace actual flight instruction. Thanks for listening, and remember, fly safe.